The Oregon Trail and Westward Expansion, A History Perspectives Book by Kristen Marciniak. Table of Contents. In this book, you will read about the Oregon Trail and westward expansion from 3 perspectives. Each perspective is based on real things that happened to real people who traveled or experienced the Oregon Trail. As you'll see, the same event can look different depending on one's point of view. This episode will be about Chapter 1, Abigail Peterson, Pioneer. Chapter 1, Abigail Peterson, Pioneer. A letter from my husband's brother William changed our lives. "Pack your things and kiss your mother goodbye, Abigail. We're going west," David whooped as he handed me the letter. A year ago, William left our rural Illinois community with a group headed toward the untamed land west of the Mississippi River. He hoped for good soil and mild weather, neither of which we had at home. Times have been tough for the past few years. We all wanted a new beginning and eagerly latched on to the idea of expanding the United States all the way west. William found what he was looking for in Oregon country. He claimed land in the Willamette Valley at the very end of the Oregon Trail. Now he was sending for his wife, Elspeth, and their 3 children. David decided we were up for the adventure too. Within a month, we purchased supplies, sold our farm and most of our belongings, and headed toward the beginning of the trail in Independence, Missouri. Our family was just one of hundreds that gathered in Independence in May 1843. It was later called the Great Migration of 1843. Altogether, we had 1,000 people, 120 wagons, and nearly 5,000 head of cattle as we started the 2,000-mile trek to Oregon country. We hoped the journey would only take 5 months. We wanted to pass through the mountains before the end of fall. The oxen that pulled the wagons were strong but slow, and we traveled just 10 to 12 miles each day. Horses, while faster, wouldn't have been able to pull all our supplies. Our wagon carried all of the staples we'd need for the next few months: flour, sugar, coffee, rice, and bacon. I brought my trusty cast iron skillet for cooking over the nightly campfire. Hunting supplies, bedding, candles, and tools were also packed tightly into our prairie schooner. We also had to bring food for the animals, so we hauled bags of grain. David guessed that the wagon weighed more than 1 ton once it was all packed. Not an inch of space was wasted, but the heavy load meant that we had to walk most of the time. At night, we formed the wagons into a giant circle with all the livestock in the middle. The wagons served as a stockade, keeping the animals from escaping into the wilderness. Once protected by the circled wagons, we started preparing to bed down for the night. David and Billy, Elspeth's son, unhitched the oxen and took care of the rest of the animals. The smaller children collected firewood. Elspeth and I found a stream nearby where we gathered water for washing and drinking. Then we began preparing dinner. After dinner, we washed dishes and prepared lunch for the next day. While we slept under the sky, some of the men took turns looking out for Indians. We had all heard stories of wild Indian tribes attacking wagon trains, but thankfully we never encountered any. The next morning, I'd have breakfast. Destiny was The next morning, I'd have breakfast ready for David before he fed the animals at 4 a.m., and we'd be back on the trail before the sun rose. Manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was the term politicians and leaders used to explain why the United States was meant to spread across Manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was the term that politicians and leaders used to explain why the United States was meant to spread across the North American continent. It meant the country was destined to expand to the west. John O'Sullivan first used the phrase in July 1845 in an article published in the United States Magazine and Democratic Review. The trip was grueling, and many in our party fell ill along the way. About halfway through the trip, Billy got sick. We had just gone through the South Pass, a large area of open prairie that separates the Rocky Mountains, when Billy began vomiting clear liquid. He had a fever and a thirst that could not be satisfied. It was cholera, and the poor boy was dead within a few days. Back in Illinois, we had heard that the West was healthier for our families, the fresh air curing everything from smallpox to influenza. But many people in our group never made it to Oregon country to find out. Some died from illness, and others died in accidents. People fell under wagon wheels, drowned during river crossings, or were trampled by their own animals. In all, we lost nearly 100 people between Independence and the Willamette Valley. We didn't have wood to build coffins, so most families wrapped their lost relatives in blankets and buried them under the trail. It seems harsh now, but we didn't want wild animals to pick up the scent of the bodies. The rolling wagon wheels packed down the dirt, and the last part of the trip was the hardest. Not only were our hearts broken over Billy's death, but we still had to cross the Blue Mountains and the Cascade Mountains. The weather was growing colder, and we were running out of supplies. The animals couldn't move quickly in the mountain terrain, and our already slow pace became a crawl. Some people lightened their load by completely abandoning their wagons at Fort Hall, just inside Oregon country. The only supplies they had for the next 900 miles were those they could carry. Once we reached the Dalles, a city near the end of our journey, we had to face the deadly rapids of the Columbia River. Floating down the river was dangerous, but it was the only way to get to the Willamette Valley. We had come too far to give up now. David and a few other men took the wheels off our wagon and turned it into a makeshift boat. Those without wagons felled trees and built flat-bottom rafts. In the middle of October 1843, soaking wet and freezing, we finally arrived in the Willamette Valley. Our travels had ended, but our adventure was just beginning.